Growing up, I lived with my mother in a small house during my adolescent years. She worked overnight shifts, so most weeknights I was alone from 8 p.m. until 4 a.m. This happened a few months before my high school graduation. On a typical night, I said goodbye to my mother at 7:30 p.m. as usual, then played video games for a few hours. Being a school night, I couldn't stay up too late, but I still remained awake longer than I should have. Around 11:30 p.m., I turned everything off and went to my bedroom, but spent another hour on my phone before finally falling asleep. I woke suddenly to what sounded like a door closing downstairs. Glancing at my bedside clock, I saw it was 3:30 a.m. Assuming my mother had returned early from work, I tried to go back to sleep while listening to footsteps moving around downstairs. After a minute, though, I began listening more intently. Usually, my mother would go straight upstairs after arriving home to prepare for bed, but these footsteps seemed to be wandering through each room. As I listened for another 2 or 3 minutes, I realized they weren't stopping at all. The person was slowly walking through every room, as if taking a tour of our house. Getting nervous that it might not be my mother, but an intruder, I got up and turned on my bedroom light. Almost immediately, the footsteps ceased. I listened at my door and heard nothing. Cautiously, I opened it and peered into the hallway, expecting to see light from downstairs, but the entire house was dark. Whoever was walking around hadn't turned on any lights, which frightened me even more. Moving silently, I stepped further down the hallway until I reached the top of the stairs. Kneeling, I looked through the railing into the living room. Nobody was there, and even in the darkness, I could tell nothing had been disturbed. My PlayStation remained untouched, which in my mind indicated there might not be an intruder after all. Surely a thief would have taken the most valuable item in plain sight. At this point, I just wanted to know if it was my mother who had been walking around, or if I was experiencing some strange auditory hallucination. I walked down the stairs and called out, "Mom, you home?" No response or movement came from anywhere in the house. I proceeded through the hallway into the kitchen. Immediately, I noticed a shoe print on the tile floor. Looking up, my eyes locked with a figure across the room. A man sitting at our dining table wearing a dark mask. His clothing was entirely black, making it difficult to discern any specific features. He stared at me with an emotionless expression, neither speaking nor moving. I sprinted back upstairs, locked myself in my room, and called 911. The operator kept me updated on the police's estimated arrival time, but after a minute, I heard the man slowly cross the downstairs floor and approach the bottom of the staircase. I whispered frantically to the operator until I heard the front door open and the man walk away from the house. Not 30 seconds later, headlights illuminated my window. My mother had pulled into the driveway. I ran outside to meet her and explain what had happened. When police arrived, they conducted a thorough search, but found nothing that would help identify the intruder. From what we can gather, the man wasn't there to rob us. He also showed no interest in me, which suggests he was likely waiting to harm or abduct my mother. This would explain why he broke in just before she normally returned home. It terrifies me to think about what might have happened if I hadn't gone downstairs, or if my mother had arrived just a minute earlier and entered the house unaware of the man waiting inside. I'm 32 and live alone in a rural house. I have a few neighbors about half a mile away whom I occasionally speak with, but I mostly keep to myself, only going into town when necessary. I'm semi-retired, spending most of my time at home, though I do contracting work a few months each year. Late last autumn, I was outside storing my yard equipment in the shed to prepare for winter, just tools, lawn mowers, and other items I'd left out during the warmer months. While working, I noticed something unusual. A man walking along the road that connected to my driveway. He carried nothing, no backpack or camping gear. For context, this road was entirely deserted except for the few houses like mine, and the nearest town was a 4-hour walk away. I observed him until he disappeared down the road. Afterward, I looked in both directions, but saw no vehicles parked on either side. It was strange, but eventually I stopped thinking about it and finished my yard work, returning inside before dark to make dinner. As I was eating, a sudden thud from outside startled me. It sounded like it came from the direction of my shed, and when I looked through the window, I saw the shed door standing wide open. It was old, but the door had never unlatched on its own before. Uncertain about what was happening, but knowing I needed to close the door, I grabbed my rifle as a precaution, though I wasn't expecting anything dangerous. Walking toward the shed, I listened carefully, but heard nothing beyond the quiet night. I also scanned the field, but saw no signs of wildlife or people. At the open shed door, I turned on my flashlight and shined it inside. Nothing appeared disturbed. I entered and conducted a more thorough search for any hiding animals, but found nothing. After securing the door, I started back toward the house. As I crossed the field, an eerie feeling grew within me, intensifying as I reached the front door. I stepped inside and locked it behind me. Walking into the hallway, I noticed a dirty shoe print on the floor. I flicked on the light and saw a trail of muddy footprints leading to the spare bedroom door. My heart raced as I raised my rifle and took a deep breath. Carefully approaching the door, I leaned my head against it and listened, hearing what sounded like someone breathing just on the other side. Before I could decide what to do, the handle twisted from my grip and the door swung open. I jumped back, raising my rifle as a man appeared, poised to charge at me while holding a large metal shovel as a weapon. The presence of my gun seemed to stop him in his tracks. He stood in the doorway, clutching the shovel threateningly, his face contorted with rage. I shouted as loudly as I could for him to stay back, trying to sound intimidating despite my terror. The man maintained his distance, but his expression of anger never wavered. We stood in this strange standoff as I tried to determine my next move. Police wouldn't arrive for probably an hour if I called, and I definitely didn't want to hold him at gunpoint for that long, risking something unpredictable happening. As we remained in this tense silence, the man suddenly hurled the shovel in my direction and sprinted back into the room. I rushed in to see what he was doing and watched as he began crawling out the window. Part of me wanted to stop him, but another part couldn't bring myself to act. He jumped out and fled across the field, disappearing into the vast emptiness of the night, leaving me with no way to track where he had gone. To this day, that man has never been identified, and his intentions remain unknown. All I can say with certainty is that if I hadn't been holding my rifle, or if he had managed to surprise me, I likely wouldn't be alive to tell this story. I don't travel out of town often, so this was one of the few times I needed accommodations other than staying with friends or family. The area I was visiting was small, with mostly unappealing hotels, but to my surprise, there was a single home listed on Airbnb. It was my first time using the platform, but the house looked far better than the hotels, so I booked it. The following week, I made the 14-hour drive to this small town. Arriving well after dark, the place appeared almost deserted compared to my home city. All the houses were dark, stores closed, with no people or cars in sight. Of course, it was the middle of the night, so I didn't expect this small community to be bustling. But the emptiness still created an unsettling first impression. The street leading to the Airbnb wound through a forested neighborhood until I finally reached the house. It was one of the few with porch and outdoor lights illuminated, but I also noticed a light shining from an upstairs window. Assuming the previous guest had simply left it on by mistake, I thought nothing of it as I gathered my belongings and approached the front door. I retrieved the key code from my email, unlocked the door, and entered, securing it behind me. After quickly dropping my bags in the corner, I went upstairs to turn off the forgotten light. It was in one of the spare bedrooms, which contained only a bed and small dresser. I switched it off and proceeded to the master bedroom to unpack my things. Though I was staying just one night, I had booked for 2 since I needed to remain in town late the following day. I stayed awake for about an hour before finally getting into bed. As I lay there trying to sleep, I suddenly heard a thud reverberate through the walls. I sat up, staring at the door, attempting to identify the source of the noise, but no explanation came to mind. I got up to investigate, quietly opening the door and peering into the upstairs hallway. It was dark and silent now, no more thuds, just the sound of the house settling in the wind. I retreated and gently closed the door, but a strange feeling kept me waiting and thinking about the sound I'd heard. As I stood there, soft creaks began traveling along the floorboards from the other room, moving into the hallway and gradually approaching my door. I listened with my ear pressed against the wood as the creaking continued right up to the other side of the door. Shocked, I grabbed the handle tightly to prevent it from turning. A moment later, I felt pressure as someone tried to open it. When I resisted, they briefly eased off. There was a brief pause before the handle was violently forced down and the door slammed partway open. I glimpsed half a face in the doorway, eyes filled with unexpected rage. After a struggle, I somehow managed to force the door closed again and lock it. The person on the other side tried desperately to reopen it, but after shouting several obscenities at me, ran downstairs and out of the house. Still catching my breath and processing what had happened, I called 911. Despite the town's small size, police arrived quickly. The Airbnb owner continued handling the case after I departed the next day, but I wish I'd stayed informed. That man seemed determined to enter my room and was in some inexplicable state of fury, as if I'd personally wronged him. The entire incident continues to disturb me, and I haven't used Airbnb since. About 3 years ago, I stayed in a rental house while visiting my brother. He lives 6 hours away, and since his one-bedroom apartment can't accommodate guests, I have to find alternative lodging when I visit him. The house I rented was close to his apartment and cost the same as nearby hotels, making it an easy choice. I arrived in town early that morning, had lunch with my brother, bought groceries, and returned to the rental around 5 p.m. The place was sparsely furnished, just a couch, TV, and bed, but the price seemed fair. I stayed up until 9 p.m. before going to bed, exhausted from the long day and looking forward to a good night's sleep. I lay awake longer than expected, finally falling asleep after about an hour. When I opened my eyes again, the room was completely dark, and I sensed it was the middle of the night. Before I could check the time, I heard movement outside my bedroom, footsteps slowly walking down the hallway, followed by a door softly closing, then silence. It felt as if my entire body had frozen as I lay in bed, staring into the darkness. After a minute of hearing nothing further, I got up and looked into the hallway. At the far end, I could see the front door, which I recognized as the one I'd heard close. I wasn't sure if someone had entered or left the house. I quietly checked all the rooms but found no one. The only sign anyone had been there was that the front door was unlocked. Finding no footprints or missing items, I secured all the doors and called 911. The police arrived quickly, but offered little help beyond suggesting I ensure all doors were locked and contact the property owner. I remained awake for the rest of the night, waiting for morning. After calling the rental owner to explain what had happened, I went to visit my brother. While I was out, the owner messaged to let me know he'd changed the door code, which somewhat alleviated my concerns. I spent the entire day with my brother, having dinner and drinks before being dropped off at the rental between 8 and 9 p.m. I settled on the couch, feeling drowsy but anxious about the previous night's incident. Every time my eyes began to close, fear of the intruder returning jolted me awake. Knowing I needed rest after missing sleep the night before, I decided to check the entire house again to ease my mind. I inspected the living room and kitchen, then proceeded down the hallway to the bedroom. After examining the closet and attached bathroom, I heard footsteps suddenly running through the hallway toward me. I turned just in time to glimpse a large man as he slammed the bedroom door shut. His footsteps retreated toward the living room, and for about 2 minutes, I heard him moving around the main areas of the house before the front door opened and closed behind him. The police responded quickly to my second call, and this time the homeowner also came. The living room and kitchen had been thoroughly ransacked, furniture scattered everywhere, cabinets opened, and their contents strewn across the floor. Upon closer inspection, however, the owner couldn't identify anything missing. It appeared the intruder was searching for something specific rather than random valuables. I abandoned the rental for a hotel that night and left town a few days later without receiving any updates on the case. I assume the perpetrator was never identified, but the situation has left me with lingering questions. Where was he hiding when I checked the house that first night? How long had he been inside with me? Was he watching me? And what would have happened if I had fallen asleep on the couch? I was 22 and living in a tiny one-bedroom house in my city's most affordable neighborhood. One Friday evening after work, I was gaming online with friends. The perfect night to stay up late with heavy rain outside and no obligations the next day. We played for about 2 hours before a sudden thump interrupted us. It sounded like it came from upstairs, and my first thought was that the rainfall might have caused a roof leak. I went up to investigate. The only rooms upstairs were my bedroom and a half bathroom, but neither showed any signs of water damage. I returned to my game and continued playing with my friends until 2 a.m. when everyone logged off. I settled on the couch with snacks, watching videos on my phone. 10 minutes later, I heard another thump, again from upstairs, but so muffled it almost seemed to come from the roof itself. I conducted an even more thorough search of both upstairs rooms, but found nothing that could explain the noise. I was certain it wasn't thunder because it vibrated through the walls, like something physically striking the house. After 10 minutes of fruitless searching, I became so determined to identify the source that I put on shoes and went outside in the rain. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then I noticed a tree branch fairly close to the side of my house. It was a substantial, sturdy branch, though still 3 or 4 feet from the siding and not swaying much despite the rain. It seemed unlikely that it could reach and strike the house. As I studied it, I realized the branch partially obscured a small window I'd never noticed before. This window was positioned higher than my bedroom window, suggesting an attic, which surprised me, as I had no idea the house had one. The roof wasn't steeply sloped, so it hadn't occurred to me there would be space for an attic, and I'd never seen any access point. I went back inside, even more curious than before, and began searching for an attic entrance. Eventually, I found it inside my bedroom closet, small and perfectly flush with the ceiling, blending in except for tiny gaps where it opened. Standing on a box, I pulled it down, releasing a rusty ladder. Immediately, a putrid smell hit me, followed by another thump from within. I could tell the attic was extremely low, perhaps 2 feet tall at most. I carefully climbed up and peered into the dark, confined space, essentially a wide, dark tunnel. At the far end, near the window, I made out a figure crouched on all fours, staring directly at me. I nearly fell off the ladder in my haste to escape, hearing movement above as I grabbed my phone and fled the house, calling 911 from the driveway. Police arrived and apprehended the man, who turned out to be homeless. He had apparently climbed the tree to the window and been living in my attic for at least a week without my knowledge. I moved out shortly afterward, and in every home since, I've always checked for attic spaces. What haunts me most is the image of that man at the end of the narrow attic, on hands and knees, staring at me with eyes reflecting both fear and anger. For several years, I've been working 2 jobs, typically leaving home around 6 a.m. and not returning until 10 p.m. After a brief night's sleep, I repeat this exhausting schedule most days. A couple of months ago, I arrived home one night and followed my usual routine: shower and prepare for bed. While in the shower, I heard movement that seemed to come from just outside the bathroom door. I quickly checked but saw nothing, so I assumed it was just the house settling. After finishing my routine, I went to bed. Throughout the night, odd noises woke me repeatedly, creaking sounds from various parts of the house, similar to what you might hear during strong winds making a structure sway. But there was no wind, no explanation for these disturbances. At one point in the middle of the night, I even got up and walked around trying to identify the source, but found nothing unusual. The next morning, I was exhausted, but had to work all day, relying on coffee to stay alert. By the time I returned home, I was desperate for a good night's sleep. I went straight upstairs and turned on the shower. But before stepping in, I heard something outside the bathroom door again. This time, I was certain it was right outside, and it sounded like it passed by and exited my bedroom. Though it seemed improbable, it genuinely sounded as if something had moved across my room. I knew I needed to investigate, despite my unease, When I finally mustered the courage to look, I found nothing. I quickly checked each room in the house, but concluded it must be something unusual in the walls or under the floorboards. I showered and went to bed, falling asleep just before midnight. I woke suddenly, instantly aware that something was wrong. The room was pitch dark, well into the night, and the house was completely silent. I wasn't sure what had awakened me, but I sensed it was connected to the strange sounds I'd been hearing. Glancing toward the door, I saw slight movement, a shadow shifting beneath the crack. I sat up abruptly, staring across the room as my heart began racing. The shadow moved away from the door, and I heard footsteps traveling down the upstairs hallway. Terrified but fueled by adrenaline, I leapt from bed and flung open the door. Standing at the end of the hallway was the silhouette of a man. The only distinguishable feature in the darkness was his eyes, which seemed to pierce through me with anger and restlessness. I slammed my bedroom door shut and locked it. The man immediately descended the stairs, but it took another 30 seconds before I heard him leave the house. Police arrived quickly after my call, but had limited success in their investigation. They found evidence that someone had been living in my house for at least several days, but that was the extent of their discoveries. I still don't know where he was hiding, but I often wonder if he was sleeping in my bed and would quickly hide in the closet when I got in the shower, using that opportunity to leave the room. I also question why he lingered downstairs before fleeing, when he knew I'd seen him and likely called the police. Everything remains speculation, but knowing a stranger was hiding in my house while I slept continues to terrify me. As far as I know, he hasn't returned, and there have been no updates regarding his identity. Last year, I moved to a new house far from the city. With my new remote job, I had no reason to remain in an overcrowded, expensive urban area. For the first few months, I thoroughly enjoyed the tranquility of my new surroundings, especially the distance from other people. Then, on an ordinary weekday afternoon, someone knocked on my door, the first visitor since I'd moved in. I opened it to find a tall, middle-aged man standing there. "How can I help you?" I smiled politely, assuming he might be a neighbor from down the street. Strangely, his first action was to lean sideways and peer past me into my house, as if checking who else might be home. Unsettled by this behavior, I partially closed the door and blocked the entrance with my body before saying anything further. The man turned and walked away without speaking. I watched as he went down the driveway to the street, where he got into a parked car and drove off. This was undoubtedly the oddest encounter I'd ever experienced, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. That evening, I stayed home for dinner, just to ensure the man didn't return. I considered calling the police to file a report, but thought I might sound foolish reporting someone who had simply come to my door and done nothing. Around 9 p.m., I turned on the television, trying to relax before bedtime. As I sat on the couch, I heard voices outside, muffled but distinct enough to recognize at least 2 people talking somewhere in my backyard. I rushed to the rear window and opened the blinds. In the distance, I could see 2 figures moving across my property. One carried what appeared to be a long tool or implement, while the other was too far away to see clearly. They walked between trees until they reached the side of my house. I moved to the side window, attempting to track their movements, but lost sight of them, and they had stopped talking. I checked every window, but couldn't locate them anymore. Suddenly, loud knocking at my front door made me jump. I approached quietly and looked through the peephole. A man in dark clothing with a hat obscuring his eyes stood on the porch, likely one of the men I'd just seen. But where was his companion? "What do you want?" I shouted, hoping to either get a response or frighten them away. The man remained silent, glancing toward the side of the house before returning his attention to the door. After a few seconds, his lack of response intensified my fear. I retreated to the living room for my phone, but was interrupted by a loud smashing sound, followed by several more. Looking across the hall, I saw a man attacking my back door with a shovel. When he noticed me, he briefly made eye contact before running away. Terrified and uncertain whether to call the police or find a hiding place, my thoughts were interrupted again when I heard the side window being struck repeatedly. I dialed 911 while the pounding continued, but just as the operator answered, everything went silent and remained that way until police arrived. When they pulled up, there was a sudden commotion outside. The man who had knocked on my door hadn't left. Upon closer inspection, he was the same visitor from earlier that day. Strangely, when police detained him, he refused to acknowledge the other man's existence or provide any explanation for his behavior, despite clear damage to my doors and windows. Weeks later, the man still refused to explain why he had visited twice that day or identify his accomplice. The entire situation remains unresolved and continues to disturb me. Why was he so determined to break in? And what purpose did the man at my doorstep serve in this attempted invasion? I moved away within months, hoping that it wasn't me they were targeting, or still are. I was using Craigslist to sell an office chair I no longer needed. It was in excellent condition, barely used, but simply surplus to my requirements. After a few days of listing it, I received a message from a man interested in purchasing it. We had a brief phone conversation, and he seemed pleasant enough. Better still, he was willing to pay my asking price, making the transaction seem perfect. We arranged to meet in a local Walmart parking lot, my choice to keep the exchange in a public setting. Friday afternoon, I called to let him know I was on my way, then drove to the store, arriving exactly on time. He had mentioned driving a grey Honda Civic, which I realized was frustratingly generic and essentially useless information. He knew my vehicle details too, so I hoped he'd spot me and approach. As time passed without any sign of him, I sent a text and later called, but he wasn't answering. After waiting nearly an hour while the sun began to set, I decided to return home, annoyed at having wasted my time. For most of the drive back, I was simply irritated, but halfway home, I realized a car had been following me for a while. This made me nervous, but when I turned onto my street, the vehicle drove away. After getting inside and setting down my belongings, I went back out to bring in the chair. As I walked down my driveway, a car pulled up and parked directly in front of my house. Though I couldn't be certain, it appeared very similar to the one that had been following me earlier. A dark red sedan, approximately 15 years old, with rust along its body. I quickly retrieved the chair from my car and hurried inside, closing the garage and securing all doors. Peering through the windows, I watched as the car remained parked, engine still running. I checked my phone again to see if the prospective buyer had responded, but there was still nothing, which only increased my anxiety. After another minute, I heard a car door open and close. Looking out again, I saw a figure in dark clothing standing beside the vehicle, facing my house as if studying it. Upon seeing this, I closed the blinds and called 911, explaining that a suspicious individual was outside and might have followed me home. They dispatched an officer, and I thanked them before hanging up. I cautiously checked the window once more. The car remained, but the man had disappeared. My heart rate accelerated as I went to each window to look, but it wasn't until I reached the back door that I spotted him again, standing inside my fenced backyard, staring up at my house. I had no idea what he was doing, but it terrified me, and I feared he might attempt to break in at any moment. After a few seconds, the man started moving toward the side of my house. I returned to the front window to see if he was heading back to his car, but he didn't reappear. I checked every window again, searching for him, but minutes later, police arrived. The car remained outside my house, but the man was nowhere to be found. Strangely, the vehicle was completely empty, not even a scrap of paper or fingerprint inside or outside. Investigators discovered it had been purchased from a junkyard years earlier, but that was the earliest record they could find. The police were as perplexed as I was, especially since the man had simply vanished. I was 18 that summer, enjoying my break before college started in the fall. With no job to worry about, I spent most days lounging around the house, playing video games, scrolling through social media, or binging shows on Netflix. My parents had gone on a weekend trip, leaving me with the house to myself, something that happened often enough that it wasn't a big deal. Sometimes I'd invite friends over, but that night I was enjoying the solitude. Around midnight, as I was watching reruns of my favorite show while scrolling through my phone, someone knocked on the front door. I paused the TV and went to check who it could be at such a late hour. Thankfully, a moment of clarity hit me before I thoughtlessly opened the door. I peered through the peephole and saw two men standing there in similar attire, waiting for a response. I remained silent, watching and hoping they'd leave. After a few seconds, one of them called out, "Hello, we're looking to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Miller." They were referring to my parents, though I've changed the name for privacy reasons. Confused but wary, I stayed quiet, knowing it was far too late for any legitimate visit. After about a minute, the men exchanged quiet words before walking away from the porch. The outdoor lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, and I never heard a car start up, which made me wonder if they'd walked to our house. An odd detail that only intensified my unease. I returned to the living room, but left the TV paused so I could listen for their return. Within minutes, I heard footsteps outside. Instead of knocking again, they began making their way around to the side of the house. I ran to the back window and watched as they entered our fenced backyard. I hid from view but could hear them at the back door, talking quietly before they started tampering with it. I took this opportunity to grab my phone and hide in the garage. I called the police, explaining the break-in attempt in progress. Less than a minute later, a loud pop echoed through the house as the back door slid open. Their footsteps moved through the house directly to the stairs, heading up to the bedrooms. I heard a door open and close, followed by silence. I waited in terrified stillness for 10 excruciatingly long minutes before police cars pulled up outside. When they arrived, I heard quick footsteps upstairs, followed by the sound of the two men arguing. Officers entered through the back door and rushed upstairs while another came to the garage and escorted me outside. The men didn't resist arrest, but they also refused to say why they were there, despite weeks of investigation and the obvious fact that they weren't simply robbing the house. The only charge authorities could make stick was breaking and entering. What still haunts me is that they seem to be specifically looking for my parents and might have been planning to wait upstairs until they returned from their trip. I often wonder if I should have revealed my presence and whether that would have prevented the break-in, but something about their behavior suggests they would have entered anyway and done whatever was necessary to deal with me. That thought keeps me awake at night. I live on the outskirts of a small town in Montana. The primary reason I chose this location was because owning a substantial piece of land is actually achievable here, unlike in most other states. My house is modest, but it provided enough comfort for living on my own. This incident occurred 4 years ago in 2019, during a particularly rainy spring, when we had downpours almost daily for a month straight. It was a Sunday, and I was enjoying my day off, watching television and relaxing. Around dusk, I heard an unexpected knock at my door, barely audible over the pounding rain. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see a stranger standing there, not a delivery person or any expected visitor. Someone coming all the way to my property unannounced was unusual given how remote it was. "How can I help you?" I asked. The man, who appeared to be in his late 20s, claimed he'd been camping in the nearby woods and had encountered some trouble. He said he needed a place to stay for the night. Given my home's location, if he wasn't lying, it would make sense for him to approach my house since I was the closest residence to those woods by at least 5 or 6 miles. The torrential rain made me sympathetic to his plight, but it didn't override my concern about letting a stranger into my home. I offered to let him make a phone call to arrange transportation into town, but he declined. After I bluntly stated he couldn't stay, the man walked away. I watched him go down the dirt road a short distance before he veered off into the forest. Though odd, I didn't dwell on the encounter for more than a few minutes before returning to my show. At least 2 hours later, well after nightfall, I noticed an orange glow coming from my backyard window. I pulled back the curtain and through the rain and fog, saw a campfire flickering under a large tree in the woods behind my house. Standing beside it was a silhouette holding something I couldn't identify. I couldn't tell if the figure was facing my house or the deeper forest. I closed the curtains and called the police to report the trespasser. I knew it would likely take an hour for them to reach me, and the person wasn't directly threatening me, but I wanted them gone before I went to bed. After hanging up with the officer, I checked the window again. The fire still burned faintly, but the figure had vanished. Then I heard footsteps approaching the house. I rushed to another window and caught a glimpse of the man walking past, now carrying a hunting rifle, before he disappeared around the corner toward my front door. He pounded on it several times, then fell silent. I retrieved my handgun from the hallway closet and pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing to process the danger I was facing. He struck the door again, this time with what sounded like the stock of his rifle, nearly breaking through a panel. In that moment, I knew I had to deter him immediately before the situation became life or death. I fired a shot toward the edge of the doorframe. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, temporarily robbing me of hearing. When my ears cleared, all I could hear was the rain. No footsteps, no banging, no shouting. After gathering my courage during 5 minutes of silence, I checked the peephole. The porch was empty, and I could see fresh footprints in the mud leading away from the house. The man had fled immediately after my warning shot. Police conducted a thorough search and discovered something disturbing near the campfire site. A duffel bag that appeared to have been buried and recently excavated. They told me it likely contained tools for burglary or possibly even murder, planted in advance to be retrieved and used later. This meant whoever attacked me had planned it and had been on my property at least once before that night. Why he targeted me specifically remains unknown, as does his identity and current whereabouts. Questions no closer to being answered now than they were 4 years ago. I still live in the same house and worry daily about his return. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's horror story and want more creepy tales like this, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. If you've got your own scary experiences, or if you have any feedback on the quality of my narration and the writing, I'd love to hear about your opinion in the comments below. Stay safe out there, and I'll catch you in the next video.